Thank you, Halla, for joining me again today. I've been so looking forward to speaking with you, especially now that we seem to have a light at the end of the Corn tunnel, albeit a light that has been much darker and much longer for women.
Sure has. Thank you for having me.
Just to start it all off, there has been a recent terrible statistic that sums up what we're talking about here, is that the December job numbers in the United States reported that for the first time in 8 months, the economy saw a dip in job growth, which was 100% women. Every person that lost a job, which has been just endemic of the pandemic. There's also some very positive statistics, which yesterday in The Guardian, they reported that for the first time in the United Kingdom, in the major companies, there's been 50% growth in the directors of women in these top companies, although it's still not a great total number in that there are only 30% of women in these boards. So some forward, some back. You and your team, particularly with this beautiful title that you happen to have, which is the Chief Change Catalyst, have been at the forefront of driving so much change of the past decades. How do we, at this moment, for a very long introduction question, how are you looking at it? How are you looking at this moment? And in particular, for our audience, what do we do?
Well, it's not a surprise that it is a complicated opening question, because these may be some of the most complex times we've ever lived. And I sometimes refer to a famous novel we all know. It is the pandemic itself has been some of the worst of times and some of the best of times. And it's kind of an interesting tension that I think every one of us feels right now. On one hand, there are plenty of reasons to be full of fear. And we certainly have seen, maybe 25 years going backwards on some issues that really matter to women and women's role in business and in the economy. And on the other hand, I don't think I've ever been more optimistic that this is the reset that I certainly have dedicated decades of my career to try to drive forward, because we're all awake now and we know that business as usual is no longer an option. And if you put it into a more of a bigger context than the pandemic, COVID hit us on top of multiple crises, from climate to inequality to probably the lowest trust era we have ever experienced in the world. So you could say COVID came on top of a burning planet and a broken social contract. And so how are you going to fix that? Going back to what we've been doing? No longer an option. Going forward to reimagining, rethinking, and resetting our world on a track that makes more sense, is more sustainable, is more equal, is more trusted, is absolutely the road we now are choosing and have to choose. And women in leadership, women in entrepreneurship, women as investors, and men who get that a gender-balanced world is an innovative world, is very much the path that I believe we're going on. So on balance, I see a lot of challenges, but I'm incredibly hopeful too.
I like that you said fear, and it was very quick, and you've spent so much more time on optimism and hope, because I feel the same thing. I feel in some way that the pandemic, for me, for a lot of business folks, startups and full-time, it's been an elimination diet. Everything was stripped away, and now we have the first time the option just to go back and add back what we miss, what we need, and all of those things that we didn't have before.
Absolutely. And you know what, Robert, I have to be honest, it is a choice every day when we wake up, if we are going to be stubborn optimists or if we're going to give in to the fear mongering. And a lot of things in our world, from the media to the way many politicians speak, to the way many businesses are not acting in the way that we expect them to, and so on and so forth, it is easy to give in to fear and despair. So it is a choice every morning to be radically or stubbornly optimistic, as one of our B team leaders, Christiana Figueres, often calls it. And she was the architect of the Paris Agreement. And hey, listen, US has just joined that global agreement again. And so I have every reason to feel that we are turning a corner, but it's not an easy one. And I don't want to gloss over that the pandemic isn't over. And women, and particularly women of color, have been hit incredibly hard. And there's a realism that we need to bring to this moment. But I'm absolutely certain that this is also our greatest opportunity to advance issues that are for the good of all of us.
I agree, could not agree more. And I feel as though that also having stripped away everything as you're talking and having this optimism that each one of us has a right, as well as the morning decision when you get out of bed, to be a part of what we want to see. Mm-hmm. Like this is a moment in time where if we want to see gender equality, a change in the climate, a better political situation, fill in the blank in terms of all of these challenges that you outlined earlier, it's got to start with us getting out of bed and wanting to be a part of it.
For sure.
You've had such a broad career, from mother to political aspirant as presidential candidate in Iceland. You had to get out of bed every day in each one of those situations. And you've told a fascinating story in the past around befriending your imposter. Could you, since I think it's such an important and an interesting skill to have for any woman in business, be you a startup person or a person who's trying to make some difference in their company, could you share that story with us?
Yeah, sure. It's something I didn't always share with others, and frankly, for the longest time, thought was something I was uniquely carrying. And it's just for fun. I shared it after I was a recent CEO of the B team, working with some of the most prominent leaders in business and civil society around the world. And I shared the story publicly for the first time in front of Richard Branson, the co-founder of the Virgin Group. And next thing I know, he's blogging about him always having suffered from the imposter syndrome. So for all of you entrepreneurs out there, if the most fearless, at least seen from a distance, entrepreneur knows it, and if I've known it, done it, doing so many different things, it is something that probably a lot of people who have done a lot of important things know. So let's just first recognize that imposter syndrome, which is this feeling that you're not sure you have the answers, or that you know what you're doing, or that you are the right person to meet this moment that calls from leadership from all of us, and maybe even seriously doubting that you're good enough at all times, is something that I definitely know. But it was when I was running for president that I sort of confronted it in more powerful ways inside of myself than in any other time. I've always been working with it. And I learned to look at it differently. Instead of thinking about it as self-doubt that kind of dragged me down, I decided to befriend it and think about it as long as I listen to this voice, knowing that that's not who I am, it's just this critical voice inside of me that constantly makes me think that there are others I can go to have better answers, more insights, to learn more, to have a stronger team, that there's always more I can do. I don't settle on my laurels because I always think there's more I can do. So it actually fires me up to surround myself with people who are better than me, to go the extra mile. And I don't no longer let it rob me of energy. And I now don't ask anymore, who am I to run for president, or who am I to speak in front of Richard Branson? I ask, who am I not to? Because each and every one of us has a voice and a set of values that matters to us and our children and our grandchildren. And why wouldn't we show up and let it be heard? And this is the strongest message I really have to women now, because women's voices we're often told we speak a lot, and it certainly is true for me. But the fact is that all the research shows us that women's voices are less heard, less seen in the boardroom, in the media, and certainly in the world of entrepreneurship. And I just think we will be better when we let it be heard.
So much so. And again, so beautifully stated. But we have now this audience today in the room, so to speak, in the Zoom room, so to speak, of now hundreds, if not thousands, of imposters. What do we all do together as if we tap into our imposter? How can we be part of on a global level, the very bold plans and and what we need to do not to have anything rolling back, to take advantage of the progress that's made? Again, from all of your perspectives, if we can gather the power of all of our imposters, there's got to be something. What one thing would you ask us to do?
Well, there's a personal side to this, and then there is an organizational side, and then there's a societal side, I think. And on the personal side, I think it's almost like a decision. Let me no longer let the imposter run my life. Let my true voice and values come out. And we just spoke to that. Organizationally, at the B team, we are pushing a campaign now that I hope can collectively help us change things in the world. And we call it Change Who to Change How. So we know how we've been leading and doing business isn't working. It's left us with a mess of a problem on our hands. And we do not want to give up on the entrepreneurial spirit or the capitalistic drive, but we need to change who is around the table, be it the boardroom table, be it the table of entrepreneurship or the investment table. We cannot see or solve these great big challenges with more of the same. That's what we call the crisis of conformity in leadership. So I invite you all to think about, how do we change who in order to change how? We unlock innovation by changing who is around the table. And more of the same, people who have the same background, same color skin, same gender, same socioeconomic experiences, they neither see nor can solve these great many challenges. So that's really a big push for us. And we're pushing for leading organizations to choose to do this by 2025, to say that gender balanced and racially diverse leadership teams are no longer a nice to have. And having one of other is no longer enough. We actually need this balance of perspective to be able to push towards a world where we deliver the global goals, or where we delivered what we like to call shared well-being on a healthy planet. It isn't going to happen by continuing to do the same with the same people around the table. So change who to change how.
And you've, with the B team and your other roles, there's been some really wonderful results that are notable in terms of, for example, I think I read through some of your work that boards where women are a larger percentage of the board address climate change, lower emission, that there is a proven fact that just on that one metric alone, that there's significant improvement through diversity, through gender balance.
Absolutely. And thanks for raising that. We have, well, I feel like the conversation about women and about gender, and I would like to uplift the fact that men also have gender, and men have also been pigeonholed into kind of a business model and leadership model where competition is king and caring for people and planet has been second place. And now we need a business model where competition is king, but caring is equally important, because we cannot do business beyond these things. So one of the insights I've had on my journey around this is, first, we talked a lot about women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights. And we knew that doing the right thing for women was transformative. Then I think we went into the era, which very much was a long part of my journey, where we talked about the business case. We talked about the benefits in growing your customer base, your employee loyalty, tapping into all of the talent, really seeing sort of the opportunities and the drive that came through the business case. And I feel like we're almost now, post-pandemic, in a third wave that is so powerful and transformative to me. And that's when we realize that gender is perhaps the most transformative lever to help drive this transformation, this innovation we need. We're going through such a revolution right now, and we cannot realize what the new world is. Call it stakeholder capitalism, away from the shareholder primacy to stakeholder capitalism, isn't going to happen unless we have all the stakeholders in the room and we start really rethinking everything. And that happens by changing who. So I think gender is now a transformation lever, and it's equally powerful for a male leader who can look at his leadership and say, listen, I've been very good at competing hard, but do I know how to care deeply in a world where personal and mental well-being may very well be our next pandemic? I think these are the kind of questions that gender can unlock. So it isn't just about women versus men. It is about feminine versus masculine values. And we need a business world and an economy that values both.
I was just going to ask you about feminine values because it is such an important part of the way that you told a story many years ago to me and women in the world, which was about in 1975, all the women went on strike in Iceland and nothing happened. The banks did not open, food was not served at lunch, dinner, whatever the case, and nothing happened. And shortly thereafter, you elected the first democratically elected the first female president, and began this process of feminine values and where these roles happen to be and the importance of gender equality. And it just, it comes full circle to me when the rest of the story, just to finish it for our audience, is that somewhere midterm, that you mentioned that in the president's midterm, some little boy, 7, 8-year-olds come up to her and said, just a question, is it possible that I might ever be president? And so to have actually flipped it to so much so where it becomes such an important state and balance where we are seeing this progress. And it's critical that gender, to your point, continues to drive it, because it's something that hopefully we can all understand and we can all be better at. Back to that who to how, as you're talking about, and really, since it's all of us back to as well, it's a community of courage. I think I'm going to steal from you somewhere in there as well, because I'm sure that's ringing in my ear that's something you would have said, or you have said, that we all have to do it together.
Yeah, I think that story, and I want to be I feel so lucky that I got to grow up in a country where women had that courage when I was just a little girl. They stood together for visualizing an equal future, and Iceland would not have led the world in closing the gender gap for 11 years now, or almost 12 years now, I think, if it hadn't been for the courage of those women and the men who stood with them, and the many sons. And many men of my age say they were transformed by that day because they didn't get anything to eat but hot dogs until they sold out. Because at the time, husbands were only able to cook hot dogs by and large. These are overwhelming stereotypes, but it's a fact that when we talk about gender equality, we can no longer just talk about women at work or women in leadership. We need to talk about the work of the home. And I think what is powerful during the pandemic, also painful, is that the work of the home and the work and the school and all of this has kind of landed in the home. And this is why I often talk about the whole sort of pandemic that might be hitting us, which could be mental well-being or lack thereof, because this has been extremely taxing, and particularly for women, but many men as well, to have everything come together. But there is a benefit in it too. We now know that majority of people do not want to go back to the inflexible working ways. And I can tell you, because just yesterday I was interviewing Richard Branson, mentioning him as a sort of a known entrepreneur, but his entire life, he has blended life with work. And I have always personally felt that this work-life balance is very difficult when you are passionate. And most entrepreneurs are passionate. So I think we should welcome the benefits of this blended approach, but we have to make sure that we are able to take care of ourselves, because without taking care of ourselves, we cannot take care of our families, we cannot take care of our employees, we cannot build lasting businesses. And Arianna Huffington is another B team leader who often says, burned out people burn down the planet. And I am totally there with her. So we have to self-care, and I often say, be president of your own life is very much about taking care of your inner world and your own well-being. And people who do that well, they tend to have an approach to business and leadership that is about the well-being of people and the well-being of our natural environment that our life depends upon.
And I'm glad you're bringing this up during our conversation about entrepreneurs and intrapreneurs, those innovators inside their companies, because people will always ask, what's the business skill? What do I do? Where do I invest? How do I do these sorts of things? Mm-hmm. But they may forget that this is really the grounding factor in taking care of themselves so they can be the president of their own life and drive their company, their startup, or their investments to the levels they need to in order to achieve the goals we're talking about here. You, in talking about this shared, the values, the caring, the concern, and you had mentioned it in passing. I want to come back to it because, again, we're talking about innovation and business a little bit more. The shift from shareholder perspective to stakeholder perspective, because we do need to care about all stakeholders. And the Darren Walker's Gospel of New Wealth, your work, the work that I've been doing around how do we rethink where we all belong in a planet and not being so divorced from our customers, from the people that work in our companies, our shareholder, and rebalancing that is a lot of the work that you do as well. For an entrepreneur that's building a business, and for somebody who's an entrepreneur that's running a portion of a business, a whole business, whatever the case happens to be, where would you recommend they begin trying to rethink shareholder and more stakeholder?
Yeah, I would recommend that you start there, because it is so much easier to start with the right DNA than to try to convert an existing business. And so we had something, we had an initiative a few years back at the B team that we called Born B, which was very much about incorporating this triple bottom line thinking into the origins of your company. And what's interesting is that now we have big companies like Danone, a B team leader, that has actually pushed for policy changes in France to become the largest listed B Corp or mission company under French legislation, because they wanted to incorporate into their shareholder agreements that they were an organization that's going to take care of all stakeholders. Because part of what we are dealing with, we have on one hand an investment world that continues to measure financial success for the short term based on the shareholder primacy model. Milton Friedman, 50-year-old theory that was probably welcome at the time, has driven a lot of wealth, but has failed at sharing that wealth in a way that allows us to live in sustainable societies with a social contract that holds. So we need this. What are these next 10 years going to be about? We do not have 50 years to get this right. We have about a decade. We need a decade of accountability, decade of courage, decade of delivering the global goals. And that has to happen with a new model. And that new model has three very important shifts to it. It is shifting away from the short term, the quarterly reporting, to the long-term value creation. A great example of this came from Unilever when Paul Polman took over in 2009 and said no more quarterly reporting. So really thinking about sort of leaving behind that rear mirror view and start disclosing more on what long-term journey are you on. So that's the first shift. The second shift is away from this financial measures and metrics are the only thing that matters, to measuring what actually matters. And I think ESG is now taking hold in the investment world. There's great acceleration of money going there. So I would say companies that do this early, they stand the chance of being in front of a lot of interesting investment flow. So that's, even if it's just for your self-interest, embrace this early. But last but not least, the most interesting part, but the most difficult one, is how do we shift from the shareholder primacy governance idea model to the stakeholder governance model? And that's possible through what Danone did in France, through this new type of company, mission company. In the US, in South America, and other places, it's called benefit corporations. And some companies go through B Lab certification. But I think during this decade of accountability, if you want to earn trust of employees, customers, and investors alike, you're going to have to figure out how you're going to show up as not one of the dinosaurs of the shareholder era, but one of the forward-looking companies of the stakeholder era. And you have to do that with new metrics, more long-term vision, and better governance models. So, and I think this is happening. And the interesting thing for entrepreneurs, because we tend to still be very exit-focused, is that these companies are being bought left, right, and center for fantastic multipliers. Unilever alone has bought 6 or 8 B Corps, from Ben & Jerry's to 7th Generation. All of these, Nestle bought another company recently from this, and Mars did as well, one of my former employers. So this is the new thing, and it's happening really fast.
And it's a nice place to help move on to some audience questions here, because it is happening fast. There are rewards, and the rewards are very tangible for doing all of the right things. And you had mentioned Unilever in here as well. And they just announced that they have gender balance as of 2020, that in their senior management teams, across all of their management teams, they have proven that everything you're talking about works, which is a wonderful thing to give our audience in terms of either starting your own thing or being an investor and what to look for and the like, which is the first question I'm going to take, because I'm seeing them coming in right now along the tracking device here. And so we can do a couple. One would be, though, as an investor, what lenses should I look at to evaluate potential investments beyond looking at diversity?
Yeah, so I'm a huge believer that you have to look holistically across what I would call the ESG criteria. Under the E, you need to be looking at if the company has a plan to reduce its carbon emissions by 2050 to zero. You need to be looking what the company is doing on nature-based solutions and circularity, because the new way to have a license to operate under the E is going to be along those three pillars. Under what I would call the S, you need to be looking at human rights. Human rights due diligence is going to become the norm in Europe soon, probably law. You need to be looking at diversity and inclusion from the top to your supply chain. And you need to be looking at shared prosperity, things like pay ratios. Are you paying living wage? I mean, are you really doing things to make sure the financial well-being of your employees works? Certainly doesn't for many companies in the US. And on governance, I like to talk about governance from 3 Gs that I just think are so powerful. First one is gender and inclusion, because I think that's a transformative lever. Second one is generational lever. If you're not engaging very actively in your governance practices, in your innovation practices, in your branding and employee practices with the next generation, you're probably not getting it right. You're probably blind to what's coming, and you're in the rearview mirror and you're not looking forward. And the last one is what I would call the governance lens, and that is, how do you shift from the shareholder primacy that sits and the conformity that sits in your boardroom to the stakeholder models? And there are many different ways companies are trying, but certainly trying to think about our workers, different populations somehow heard and listened to in your boardroom would be a great place to start.
It's super wise. And I think that, interestingly enough, for the rest of our audience that are not investors, but are entrepreneurs or working to improve their companies as entrepreneurs, they can take that advice as well and go, like, how do I build it, or how do I look to see how I can manage through it? I'm going to paraphrase the next question, because it's from a colleague perspective, which is slightly different, and it's resonating in my mind to something you were saying around women having the extra burden. And so the question is something along the lines of, how do I help my female senior managers address the burnout they face as female leaders? Mm. The fact that and again, my paraphrasing, homeschooling, cooking meals, taking care of the family, having to have a job and all this above during the pandemic has clearly made an accelerated burnout for women. How does somebody like me help somebody else?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I wish more people ask that question, including male allies. I am very concerned about burnout in general, and in particular for women in leadership. And we see evidence of that happening right now, and I certainly hear it. I think flexibility is key, and pandemic has given us great practice in that, because it's not necessarily about not wanting to do all the work or not being able, but it's how strict it is. And less travel is actually very helpful to most women leaders, not just because they have often more of a burden in the home and the children and their parents, elder care even, but because they just don't like it as much. And it's a lot more effort for a woman to travel with everything she needs, and etc. So I think it's just, those things are helping. But most importantly, this is an era for compassionate leadership. And I think, having the courage to show up in vulnerability, show your heart a little more, show up with your humanity a little bit more, being 100% human is the best advice I can give to any colleague right now on any issue, be it for women or men. We are all tackling a lot during this time. And so let's just be a little more human. let's forget this idea that business is about using half of our brain and only our head, and let's unlock both sides of our brain, both the convergent one and the divergent one, and let's unlock our heart. And that's where vulnerability and the humanity sits. And if we do that well and align our head and our heart a little more in the way we approach work now, our hands will do the right thing, and it will certainly be much better aligned with what we want as human beings.
You could not have ended on a better note for us today, and that you have so generously unlocked your heart to share all of your wealth of insights and your wealth of compassion, your wealth of humanity, so that our audience, I can take it with me forward and do what we all need to do. Halla, thank you so very much.
Thanks, Robert. And let's just remember there's a leader inside of every one of us, and no one person is more important than another. So this is about unlocking leadership in all of us.
Absolutely. Wonderful way to end. Everybody in the audience, unlock your leader.
Thank you.
Thank you.